My name is Amjad Faur, and I'm originally from Northwest Arkansas, but I teach at the Evergreen State College now. The show that is in the Archer Gallery now is called Liban, which is a French term for Lebanon, and the use of the French deals directly with Lebanon's colonial past, and that question of the modern Middle Eastern nation and its sort of long-term legacy with its colonial past makes up the general framework of the most recent set of images that I've been working on that appear in the show. There's only 4 of them now. The work is still coming together. It's still kind of in its skeletal phase. But the show, or the body of work, that those images come from is called Sun Kings, which is obviously a direct reference to Louis XIV, and more specifically to Versailles, and the Versailles being emblematic of the Paris peace conferences that happened at the end of the First World War, and it was at those conferences that, partly at those conferences that the borders of the modern Middle East were carved up between European interests. So that's what's happening in terms of the most recent set of images. 4 of the images from this show, Liban, come from Sun Kings. The rest of them come from several bodies of work that I've made over the past 7 years or so. Bethlehem in Wax, a taxonomy of wounds, and what else is in there? Eschaton. Eschaton is the name of the most recent body of work that I've finished, which deals specifically with the overlapping kinds of imagery between Western fantasies regarding the Middle East and a lot of different kinds of map making and imagery that deals with a little bit more of the geopolitical circumstances and the visual language of geopolitics overlaid on top of that imagery that is drawn from a lot of Western art history. So the photograph itself is shot in a cut mirror that is the same shape that traces the hallways of some of the main areas of Versailles. And it's that kind of oval shape up at the top, the archway. And there's a very simple, almost crude still life, not even really a still life, just this very simple vase with some flowers in it against kind of a crude cloth background. Still delicate. What's on top of it is the use of the black void shape, where it's hard to tell if it's present or absent, if it's a cutout or something that's resting on top, that it creates an ambiguous spatial environment or reference point. The shapes in the photograph Liban in particular are the ethnic break up or break down, however you want to look at it, an ethnic map of Lebanon. And so it's a map of Lebanon that is overlaid on top of this otherwise sparse still life that is then shot within this self-contained reference point stemming straight out of Versailles itself. And so what you see in Lebanon today is purely consequential of the kind of negligence and self-interest that came out of the colonial carving up of the modern Middle East. Lebanon is an extremely unnatural state. It has no business being what it is in terms of its ethnic breakup and its borders. And so it was important to me to find this very overall ethnic breakup of Lebanon, cut it apart, pull it apart, and see what those areas look like independent of the larger borders of Lebanon, which are extremely artificial. most of the borders of the Middle East are extremely artificial in terms of ethnic makeup, regional interests, tribal interests, that they were all buried beneath the waves of European powers after the First World War, where you saw Versailles, you saw the Paris Peace Conference, you saw the Balfour Declaration, Sykes-Picot. All of these agreements had to do with European interests and not native interests of the region. And so Sun Kings, the show, is largely stemming out of a lot of the visual language that I find, and that I find compelling about this time period. Occultation is a way of expressing the idea of something that is blocked, something that is hidden from sight. And it has cosmological implications in terms of its title, but I'm a little bit more interested in the idea of this. It originally came from this idea that I had of these candles kind of all squished together, mashed together, melted together, just hanging there, just suspended in midair. And what was important to me about the image was that it existed in a way in two conceptual states, and that one has to do with the fact that these candles are lit, some of them are lit, that this thing is just suspended in air, that it's impossible to negotiate in terms of what it is, why it is, where it is, so that it defies a sense of place or time. Simultaneously, some of the candles have just been blown out. And so you see the smoke rising up from those recently extinguished candles, and the smoke itself being extremely indicative of a very, very specific moment in time, because the smoke is so ephemeral, it's moving so quickly, and that it's here one moment and absolutely gone the next. And so those two states of temporal being, this kind of timelessness, but also the very specific temporal quality of the smoke, was interesting to me in terms of describing a state of being that is suspended between two states, and one that is at one time old. We think of the peoples of the region that I'm thinking about in this work as having been native to those areas for a very, very long time, an immense history. Simultaneously, there are contemporary borders, there are contemporary states of geopolitical unrest, violence, etc., being rooted in very, very recent decisions. And so the space hovers in a state that is extremely old, but also extremely new. It's inescapable, like the newness of it is inescapable for the people of the region. Their histories, their cultures, their stories, all of it being contingent on decisions that were made by colonial powers in the early 20th century. Right? So again, thinking about liminal space, stasis, etc., and the idea of the thing that is simultaneously visible and invisible, or the thing that is seen but not understood, right? So it's this thing that is in between all these different places, and that's where the idea for that photo came from. And honestly, a lot of my work and a lot of the work that'll be in this show is kind of about that, right? It's kind of about the state of being between two places or two times or two experiences, that there's always this tension kind of pulling one from the other, because a lot of what I'm doing in the work and a lot of the images in the show is questioning the stability of spatial certainty, spatial permanence, or being able to perceive a kind of spatial ambiguity that's hard to navigate, right? It's just stuck between two ways of being. That it's a photograph, it's empirical. I mean, we have this sort of codified knowledge or received knowledge about photographs being a mechanical reproduction, and they are a mechanical reproduction of a state of being in a very specific place at a very specific time. Simultaneously, they are spatially kind of elastic and hard to determine sometimes. And so it's that quality playing with the idea of the glass mechanical eye of the camera. The photograph Night Wedding is, it's one of the photos that's a real pleasure to make, because in a way you have this luxurious format of the the Dutch still life, or something that's really kind of decadent looking. And I mean, again, the title referring to something ceremonial that I also think of with the photograph for Occultation, but something ceremonial but still unseen, right? Still private, something that happened behind closed doors. That a lot of the reference points for the language that I'm using in the titles or some of the imagery, again, it's bouncing off of this moment in time in which decisions were made for millions and millions of people by a handful of people that didn't even live there, right? You're talking about France and Britain deciding how the peoples of the Middle East were going to be controlled and how they were going to live their lives. And so, so you see a lot of that moment in time for me sort of bouncing off of some of these images and some of the language. And so to return to the image itself, yeah, I mean, it's spoken in the dialect of Western painting and of the still life. Again, there are elements of it, though, that then kind of defy the want to make it truly kind of seductive or traditionally beautiful, right? You have the mirror that kind of consumes most of the area of that photograph, but the mirror its only function is truly to suck that plastic, that real nasty, painter's plastic that hangs in the back of the whole thing back down into it, right? It's this kind of ugly portal that happens amidst all this very beautiful, decadent fruit. Additionally, in that photograph, in Night Wedding, part of what was important was that you didn't just have the plastic kind of hanging in the back, but that the very kind of sensual, decadent fruit or the flowers also was kind of tainted by that wet plastic. And for me, that wet plastic is just real morbid. It is really, really unpleasant. It's still very tactile. It's still very beautiful in its own way, but totally morbid, for me at least. And that's where it's coming from, dragging the body out of the lake or whatever, right? And so, yeah, I mean, I think that I think it corresponds to a lot of my interests in the construction of photographs and the construction of a still life or some kind of scene, that you're playing off of a certain kind of expectation about what you're seeing and the anticipation of what a photograph should yield to you. And in this instance, it's this very, it's not, the juxtaposition is not extreme, right? It's not hideousness and beauty pitted together. It's something traditional, it's something traditionally beautiful as we might understand it as a Western audience, but it's interrupted with these other small things, right? Something something that is just uneasy enough to kind of ruin everything else. A hollow chamber was actually the first photograph that I made for Sun Kings, and I mean, you can see it in that the initial responsiveness to this idea of the mirrors coming, you know, my visual interest and conceptual interest in Paris and Versailles, and being really interested in the use of the mirror, the use of light. And I wanted to make a photograph that was filled with mirrors and filled with light, but kind of hard to tell that it was filled with either of them, right? And so the whole thing is kind of, you know, interrupted with this fog and with this kind of billowing cloth, but it's these mirrors that are at 90 degrees from each other, reflecting each other back and forth, and there's a ton of light coming down on this thing. But the image itself just gets real muddy, and it just kind of loses that sense of that kind of reflective grandeur that you might anticipate out of an image like that. And you know, being the first image, it's really only responsive to some of the initial ideas and interests in this time period, in this place, and so it is kind of this inaugural image that is not as closely tied to a lot of the research that then went into some of the other images. But as an inaugural image, I think it's compelling in that it shares this use and language of light, of reflection, but it has both of them kind of hobbled, right, by these other factors. And so the kind of celebratory quality of both of those features then being diminished. The photograph behind me here, atmospheric perspective, is representative of my technique in that I made it, for the most part, the same way that I have made everything that you'll see in the show, which is to say that it is a construction. It's something that I built in a studio, and it was shot on an 8x10 camera, which produces an 8x10 inch negative. And conceptually, the most important part there is that it was shot in camera. Everything in the show, everything that I make, shot in camera, meaning that there are no after effects. There are no darkroom tricks. There's no Photoshop trick to yield the visual qualities that you see in the photograph itself. And that the same goes for all the other photographs in the show. And so, again, this comes from the show Bethlehem in Wax, and it's employing the use of mirrors, it's employing the use of the reflective surface as a way to enter into a different space while simultaneously refusing to kind of yield what that spatial quality is. So the construction of the photograph itself came from building a cube out of mirrors and suspending the cube far from a wall, and then painting this kind of celestial backdrop, painting those and taking those paintings and putting them in the entirety of the room. And so the only thing reflected in the mirror is those paintings, except for behind it, of course, where you have this, very simple kind of spatially ambiguous background, and then using silicone plastics to create this very nasty drip out of it. And so, yeah, everything that you see in the show, very simple materials, very there's nothing fancy about any of it. I'll just say that. There's nothing extravagant. I'm not a wealthy enough person to be able to employ the kinds of materials that maybe I'd like to. So they're very simple materials, but they're built and arranged in such a way that they deny a full visual access to kind of resolution about what you're seeing and how you're seeing it, and how you're seeing an object or a space exist on its own terms in a place and a time, which is contradictory to maybe what we expect out of photography in general.